Well, good evening, everyone. And we're delighted that you can join us for this evening for the launch of our latest Wilberforce Publications title, Beyond the Odds, by John Scriven and Tim Dieppe. We're also delighted that retired Major General Tim Cross is with us tonight. Well, my name is Andrew Hawkins, and I work full-time with Christian Concern. I also serve as the London Wing Chaplain for the RAF Air Cadets and Operational Chaplain for the Metropolitan Police Service, which is a frontline response ministry. So given these roles, I was asked to host this evening's launch of a book that focuses on wartime from World War I to the Falklands. And it's very apt that we're launching this new book on Remembrance Day, when we remember the sacrifice of so many for the freedom of our country. This is a scholarly book of military history infused with spiritual insight. So not only is the book fascinating from a historical perspective, but also interwoven throughout is the thread of God's provision and intervention at critical moments in wartime, attributed much to prayer and the faith of key personnel in command. Against all the odds, victories are gained and darkness is repelled. The chapter on the siege of Malta during World War II particularly gripped me. And I was 10 years old when the Falklands War happened, so I was particularly drawn to that chapter. What struck me most was the moment of prayer and inspiration that Major Chris Keeble experienced, and the ability of Padre David Cooper to effectively engage with the troops. Well, we'll be speaking to the authors shortly about their reasons behind writing this book and what we can learn today. But first, we're going to watch a short video introduction.
At 9:30 a.m. on 18th May, Rees Howes wrote in his diary, "Unless God intervenes today in a miraculous way, I believe we are lost." Beyond the Odds is about key turning points in the First and Second World Wars, when Britain was saved from disaster and in some cases national catastrophe in circumstances that defied probabilities, hence the title Beyond the Odds. As it was to do so, on more than one occasion during the war, the weather saved the British Army. Brooke wrote afterwards, "What might have happened if the Germans had attacked before the winter makes me shudder to think."
The title Beyond the Odds is trying to say, look, in these wars, in these battles, things happen that are kind of like extraordinary. And even today, some of these things are somewhat unexplained. The extent to which lots of things happen in conjunction and by chance, so to speak, but can you really say it's just by chance? If you factor in God, you wouldn't say that. And then you start to think, well, maybe it was prayer after all. And that's the idea behind Beyond the Odds. Reading his Bible by candlelight, the brigade major remembered the name of the place from 1 Samuel, chapters 13 and 14. He read that Jonathan had gone through a narrow pass between two sharp rocks to gain the higher ground where he had surprised the Philistines. Scouts were sent out and the pass was identified, thinly held by the Turks. The plan of attack was changed, and at night one infantry company was sent up through the pass. The Turks thought they were surrounded and fled, and so, concluded Major Gilbert, after thousands of years, British troops successfully copied the tactics of Saul and Jonathan.
Beyond the Odds is definitely a book that I've enjoyed reading. I mean, I am a military historian and I like reading well-researched and well-presented analysis. But what he's adding to this is a dimension that most, certainly most, if not all the other military historians never really even take into consideration, which is the impact of people's personal Christian faith and the impact of godly intervention into these events.
For me, and I think Tim as well, the context is important to understand the nature of the events. So what was the background to the events? Why were they significant? How likely were they? It's those kind of questions I think you can only look at when you look at the full history.
It's a history book, and I think it will be anybody who's interested in history, who likes reading about particularly military history, World War I, World War II, that sort of thing, will find it interesting and will find it giving a different perspective to the kind of history that you normally read on these things.
The bottom line is, it's a book that I've enjoyed reading. I'm actually going to read it again. I know I will refer back to it in the future in various different ways. Particularly, I preach every year on Remembrance Sunday, for example. So some of the stories and some of the examples are there to be used and to be useful in discussions with people.
Good. So I'm going to pose some questions now to the authors and also to retired Major General Tim Cross, who wrote the foreword to the book. And so you can ask questions as well in the comments section. Please do post any questions, and I'll try and look at those as we ask the authors some particular questions we've prepared. So firstly, John, are you there? John Scriven? And Tim Dieppe?
Hi, Andrew.
There we are. There's Tim. Have we got John with us as well?
Don't know. Maybe we've lost him for the time being.
Okay, well, let me ask you, Tim, some questions first and see if John can join us. Tim, you wrote a couple of the chapters in the book, and tell us about the chapters that you contributed.
Sure, yeah. Well, thank you for your introduction, Andrew. And I'm pleased that you said you particularly like the Malta chapter, because I wrote that chapter on Malta. And I found that very, very interesting. I'm glad you liked it. And also I wrote a chapter about Churchill and Churchill's Christianity as well. So 2 chapters relating to those 2 topics there. And the Malta chapter is really about how the governor was a Christian and various answers to prayer that occurred there. Quite dramatic, I think, some of them. And also the chapter about Churchill is about the question of the extent to which he was influenced by Christianity and had a Christian faith. And I present a lot of evidence there that he believed the Bible and saw answers to prayer and things like this. So I found Churchill a fascinating character. Read a lot of nearly all of his works, I think, and wanted to sort of show that in this book.
So you wrote about Churchill. Was Churchill a Christian then, in your view, after researching this?
Well, I'm not going to answer that question directly, but certainly he was very influenced by Christianity, put it that way. His nanny, when he grew up young, was an evangelical Christian, clearly taught him the Bible and taught him to pray. And he took that very seriously as a young boy. In fact, there's an incident in his school life when they were asked to recite the creed and turn east to recite the creed. And he relates that he worried that his nanny would have objected to turning east as a kind of popish religious thing. And so he refused to do that, which shows how seriously he took his faith at that time. And then when he went off to fight in India, he lost his faith, or he became an atheist. But at the same time, whilst being an atheist even, he did find that, as a lot of soldiers do, I think, that he still prayed in danger. A lot of people do anyway. He still prayed when there was danger. And so then he had to sort of try and rationalize the prayer. And I think he came back to more of a faith a bit later on. He talks about answers to prayer. He talks particularly about when he escaped in the Boer War. He was actually imprisoned as taken captive by the Boers there, imprisoned, hated being imprisoned, managed to escape. But then it was a difficult journey, and he found himself stuck in the middle of nowhere with vultures circling around, and he prayed a desperate prayer. And writing about it 30 plus years later, he says that prayer, those prayers, as it seems to me, present tense, were answered. So he indicates he still believes much later that the prayers were answered, and the prayers were what sorted it out for him, and God actually intervened and sorted it out and enabled him to survive that. And he quotes the Bible a lot of times in his speeches and so on. One of my favorite quotes from Churchill is this one, where he talks about the Bible. He says, "We believe the most scientific view, the most up-to-date rationalistic conception will find its fullest satisfaction in taking the Bible literally. We may be sure that all these things happen just as they are set out in the Holy Writ." And he goes on to say, the impressions these people receive were faithfully recorded and have been transmitted across the centuries with far more accuracy than many of the telegraphed accounts of goings on today. Now, look at that. That's a politician saying the Bible is more reliable than the telegrams of all the news stories and so on that he was receiving. So remarkable confidence in the accuracy of Scripture. So I think you have to say this man was infused with biblical ideas and Christian ideas, and he prayed and he believed the Bible, and he was happy to recite the creed and all that kind of thing. Whether he had a saving faith in his heart, I'm not going to judge that. I relate in the book his meeting with Billy Graham, and that's very interesting. And he agreed to be prayed for by Billy Graham, and he's very nervous about the meeting ahead of time and stuff. And who knows what happened in those moments when Billy Graham prayed for him on that day after a long conversation with him.
So that strong childhood foundation really kind of played out through his life. Yeah, and Malta. Give us a little brief overview of what happened in Malta.
Yes, so Malta, the governor appointed to Malta, a chap called General Dobby, had played a significant role in World War One, but had a very strong evangelical faith from the Plymouth Brethren, actually, and was struggling to know what to do in World War Two. Prayed about it, and nothing seemed to turn up. And then finally, he was appointed to be governor of Malta, and he took on that role and really applied his faith to it. His first message to the Maltese was, "We trust in God, and I urge you to humbly pray for God to help us in Malta." And that was the attitude he took right through. Malta was under siege. It was desperate. It was starving. There were, the difficulty for the aircraft. As a you may have read it, Andrew, but there are very few aircraft. Much harder for the RAF there than it was in the Blitz here in London and in England. And desperate situations, but they saw remarkable answers to prayer. I mean, really quite incredible. One famous one was HMS Illustrious, brand new aircraft carrier that had to come into dock for repair. The Italians knew that this was a very valuable ship. They've sent in 100 planes to bomb it. Each of them sent bombs down, and every single one of them missed. And they just saw that as an answer to prayer. They just saw that as God's mercy, and they just thought, wow, God is on our side here. And then, another occasion, a bomb hit the famous Rotunda Church, a massive iconic building in Malta, actually hit the dome. The bomb fell directly through the dome, 200 feet down onto the stone floor, and didn't explode. And there were worshippers in there at the time, and that was widely seen as an incredible miracle that this didn't happen. And there are numerous different instances like that on Malta, a really remarkable story. And I'm glad you liked it, Andrew. Yeah, and I think it's very inspiring, some of these stories.
Yes, I did find that chapter particularly gripping. Is there any, you've mentioned a few stories there. Is there any particular favourite from the book, whether it be your chapters or other chapters in the book?
Well, the story that I read in that promotion video, I still like that one. I think this is really interesting because in the World War One, they handed out Bibles to all the troops, and they did it not just for faith reasons, but actually for geographical reasons for those troops in Palestine, because it would give them some geographical knowledge. And so this commander, found he was near this place called Michmash, and he thought, I'm sure I've seen that place in the Bible somewhere. And he went and found it in 1 Samuel 13, and found the account of Jonathan and his armor bearer going through this pass and surprising the Philistines. And so he changed his plan, sent his scouts, go and find this pass that's mentioned in the Bible. They went and found it, and they went and copied the tactics, went up the same pass and surprised the Turks. The Turks, in exactly the same sort of way, were surprised and ran off. And it shows, the kind of confidence that the Bible is accurate, not just in spiritual things, but in history and in geography as well. And so, I just think that's such a great story about how people had confidence in the historical and geographical accuracy of the Bible, and that turned out to be a good trust. And I gather we've got John back now, Andrew, as well.
Oh, have we? Good. Okay, I was just going to ask you one last question, Tim. We've obviously got all these stories, the great stories in the past recorded in the book. What can we learn from these today, do you think?
Yeah, well, I find these stories inspiring. And I think this is part of why we wrote the book, to remind people that God answers prayer. When people humbly and genuinely heartfeltly seek him and ask for his help, he does graciously answer, and in remarkable ways sometimes. And this is the record of history for our nation. And so I think, we need to remember that and be inspired and be encouraged to pray ourselves, and to pray not just for ourselves, but for the nation as well, and for big things as well as little things sometimes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tim. I believe we've got John Scriven now with us. John, can you hear us? Are you on?
Can you hear me? You're now my daughter, actually, as well. So
there we are. Good to see you, John. And
her machine, which works better than mine. So here I am. And she's now leaving me.
Great to see you, John.
Yes. So, John, I want to just ask you a few questions. I've been questioning Tim. Firstly, why did you write this book? Let's hear it from you.
Well, history has always been one of my passions, and
Yeah.
I studied at university, and I was aware that there were books which recorded what are generally known as wartime miracles. There was a booklet that came out in 1952, and also there were parts of a book written in the 1980s. And I knew that from a historian's perspective, there was always more to be explored, and I wanted to look at the context of the events as well as the events themselves. But in the process, I discovered much more than I expected, particularly in relation to the First World War, where there were near escapes in both 1914 and 1918, where we were very, very near to disaster. And there are also less well-known events in the Second World War, apart from those ones which are sort of highlighted in some of those earlier books. So I started off by asking a friend who's a Christian historian to see if he could write the book, and it wasn't the right thing for him at the time. So when lockdown came along, I decided to start myself. So that was it.
Wonderful. And what are some of your favourite stories in the book, John?
Well, I think it's very difficult to not to mention Dunkirk, actually. There are so many, and there are so many very small ones as well. But Dunkirk, I think, is extraordinary because there were so many multiple events which came together. Particularly, I was really interested in the military side of things because apart from the events which may be well known to some people, like the Calm Sea and the Channel, which enabled the small boats to reach the shore and to take people on board, and also the grounding of the Luftwaffe by bad weather when the troops were heading for Dunkirk, and also the famous halt order given by von Rundstedt and then endorsed by Hitler, which halted the Panzers at a point when they could have, I think, fairly easily encircled the British forces. But on the military side, we were lucky enough, or providentially, we had two of our best commanders of the last century, Alan Brooke and Montgomery, in key roles. And they were able to, by a superb bit of military planning, able to cut off the German advance in the northeast at the Ypres Commune Canal with a superb night movement when the Belgian army collapsed in that part of the front. And then there was General Gort, who was the commander of the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, and he took a vital decision to retreat from Arras when he could have been surrounded. He then refused to comply with a war cabinet plan to break out to the south to join up with the French armies in the south, and which would have been a complete disaster, I think, had that happened, had he attempted to do that. And then, without any instructions from the War Cabinet and against their advice, he unilaterally decided to evacuate. Now, without those key decisions, then the evacuation would have been impossible. And along the way, there were some other events, like the French, or parts of the French army, French First Army, held out at Lille, possibly gaining an extra 4 days for the evacuation. And there was also the garrison at which was actually reinforced at Calais, where French and British troops held out. And then there were just selfless acts of bravery on the perimeter, where troops knew that they wouldn't survive. They'd either be captured or they'd be killed, and they held out long enough to enable troops to evacuate. So it was a whole multiple consequence of those things. And of course, prayer came into it. And I mentioned that there was a National Day of Prayer.
Yes.
Which was called by the King.
Yes, yes. And what fascinated me, the back of the book records the National Days of Prayer, different years they occurred. So, today, what would it take for a National Day of Prayer to happen again now, today?
Well, technically, a National Day of Prayer can only be called by the sovereign in consultation with the with the Prime Minister and her government. But I think on a broader perspective, I think we can say that we have strayed a long way in society from the values which were widespread in the wartime years and both wartime generations. And I think to expect God to behave in the same way that he did in the Second World War would be possibly presumptuous. I don't think we can say that God's purposes would be to protect our country from the consequences of straying away from those values. But having said that, Christians can always pray for revival, and many, many people are at the moment doing that, and praying for a return to Christian values in our nation. And I mean, until that happens, I wouldn't be confident that God would intervene the same way as he did in the Second World War.
So our nation has changed much since the Second World War. But obviously, at that time, faith did play a role in the turning points of the Great Wars. So just tell us something about that, how faith changed the course of events, perhaps.
Well, I've mentioned Dunkirk. I think I also ought to mention the faith of key commanders, actually.
Yeah.
Which was, in a way, I found it surprising, because if you take people like Brooke and Montgomery, Alexander, I mean, they had fought in the First World War, and you might have thought that could have affected their faith in some way. But in fact, if we look at the key people, Alan Brooke was the chief of the Imperial General Staff. There was Montgomery and General Alexander, both practicing Christians. In the Battle of Britain, the two key people were Air Chief Marshal Dowding and Air Vice Marshal Park. Dowding openly acknowledged divine providence, and Air Vice Marshal Park was a practicing Christian. Also, Admiral Cunningham, who commanded the British Mediterranean Fleet. There was General Eisenhower, General Morgan, the chief planner of D-Day, and others. So prayer was part of as it were, the whole worldview of many people who were commanding and fighting the war. And there's an interesting quote, actually, in Callum Brown's book, The Death of Christian Britain, in which something like this. He says that while there may not have been there was a minority with a strong personal faith, the majority had some Christian faith. And in these times of real difficulty, then that faith came to the fore. And the queues of people going to National Day of Prayer in churches and in 1940, 26th of May, just before Dunkirk, were striking it. And prayer was much more general than that. There was a moment in the BBC broadcast on what was then the home service at 9 o'clock for a minute for prayer. And then in one of his broadcasts, I think it was in D-Day, on the evening of D-Day, when George VI said that no one should be too busy to pray, and assuming that everyone would do so. So I think prayer was part of the whole scene. I think the correlations are interesting, and I really leave readers to make up their own mind about causation. I think as a historian, one can't really do that. But I think there was a connection.
Good. Just to remind people that are watching, you can post comments and questions. Please do that. John, I'm a chaplain. I'm the London Wing chaplain for the RAF Air Cadets. I'm also chaplain to the Met Police, operational. I wear body armour. I go into some pretty hostile situations and support officers and minister to the public. What about the role of military chaplains? I mentioned in my introduction, Padre David Cooper features in the chapter about the Falklands. Are there others there that you record in history?
Yes, I mean, I think in a way this would take a book in itself.
Yeah.
There are a great number of very brave chaplains.
Yeah.
The person I do mention is the Reverend Theodore Bailey, who was deployed in France in autumn 1916. He lived with the troops in the forward zones. He handed out sweets. He wrote letters for them. He comforted them. He also was an extremely brave man. He carried troops to safety when they were wounded. He was awarded the DSO in October 1918 for rescuing wounded men in no man's land. Despite suffering from a broken wrist at the time, he was awarded the MC, the Military Cross, for going under fire to help stretcher bearers. And in April 1918, he was awarded the VC, the Victoria Cross, for rescuing a wounded man within 10 meters of an enemy pillbox. And then he was sadly on October 10th of October 1918, he was killed. I had the opportunity after getting the VC to stay in the UK and in England and not expose himself to any more danger, but he refused to do that. And he went out again.
Right. Interesting. Well, field a question to both of you here. Do you think God was on the side of the British people in these wars? You read the book and you think, wow, it seems like God was really with us as a nation. Is that right? Tim, John, any comments?
Well, I think we can start by saying that I think that in both World Wars, and indeed the Falklands too, the cause was just. And I think no mainstream historian thinks that Britain would have been, or Europe would have been better off if Germany had won either war, even though we went very reluctantly into the First World War. But it doesn't mean to say the conduct of the war was all good. I mean, the bombing campaign in Germany was both a strategic and a moral failure. We failed to do anything to disrupt the Holocaust when perhaps we could have bombed the railway lines. I mean, there was a plea by Archbishop Temple to do more in relation to this, but nothing was thought practical in terms of the war effort. Interestingly, Christians like Alan Brooke and also the Secretary of State for Air, Sir Archibald Sinclair, also Christian, he opposed the bombing of Dresden, which was horrific. So I think we can say there are two things. There's a cause, and yes, victory was necessary, but the ways in which it was achieved weren't necessarily all good. And of course, I haven't mentioned the slaughter in the First World War, which in terms of the Somme and Passchendaele, which are just unbelievably awful.
Tim, any more comments around that question?
Well, I agree with John, really. I think the main point is there were just causes, and then the point that really strikes me is that the nation humbly called on God for help, and the extent to which people turned up for these days of prayer. I mean, we don't really remember this, but there are photographs of queues of people turning up outside Westminster Abbey to pray, and there are newspaper accounts from the period, local newspapers saying the biggest ever attendance in church for this National Day of Prayer. So all up and down the country, lots and lots of local newspapers record that people turned out in force for services on these National Days of Prayer, and humbly prayed and sought God and realized that this is where their real help came from. And I think that is what really made the difference here, and that's what is kind of chronicled in this book.
Good. I wondered if we could bring on retired Major General Tim Cross. Tim, are you there?
I am. Yep. Hello, Andrew.
Good that you can join us. What did you like about the book? You've read the book. Any thing that?
Yeah, I have, and I've passed it to a couple of friends, and I'm looking forward to passing it around a bit more. Let me just make a couple of quick comments on what's already been discussed, because interestingly, some of the points that have been raised are the ones that were on my mind too. But first of all, to say, going back to chaplains, there are more double VC winners of chaplains and indeed Royal Army Medical Corps than anybody else.
Okay.
Chaplains were incredibly brave during these conflicts, and I've experienced that from my own chaplains who've been with me on various operations. So they do an extraordinary job. And going back to your other question about whose side was God on, my answer to that question is very simple. It's not a matter of whose side God is on. The question is who's on God's side in this? Who's fighting for justice and righteousness? And I've got no doubt at all that we were fighting for justice and righteousness in both World War I and in particular World War II, and indeed in places like the Falklands. So we could expand on that conversation, but I think that's the question. Too often people say, is God on my side? It's not a matter of me, God on my side. It's, am I fighting alongside him? Am I doing what he is calling me to do? So going back to the book itself, we've touched on a couple of them. I became a Christian in 1981 in Jerusalem, and the guide in the Garden Tomb that day was a relative of the Malta Dobby. The Dobby family, an extraordinary Christian family, with many Christian military people on their family, including a guy called Brigadier Ian Dobby, who's a wonderful man. And this cousin, I think it was, of the Malta Dobby, was the man who brought me to faith, really, in the Garden Tomb. And I visited Malta for the first time about 4 years or so ago, and was shown around the island by a Maltese military historian who talked me through much of what John has written about and what Tim was talking about earlier on. So that chapter, that part of the book is certainly one that I relate to. The other one is the Falklands. Chris Keeble, who's the 2IC of the Parachute Battalion when Colonel H. Jones is killed, his story of how he turns to prayer and then comes up with the most extraordinary solution to the problems they were in, and they were in dire straits, to announce that he was going to go and seek the Argentinian surrender. And people thought he was completely balmy, but they did surrender. And Chris Keeble was not by chance carrying a prayer in his pocket in the middle of this battle on the Falkland Islands, which brings us back to some of the points you were saying earlier about individual Christians. I think there's two aspects to this. There is the individual Christians who are in command appointments. And, just to encourage people, the Armed Forces Christian Union today is a strong union of many, many military officers from all three services. And I was president of it for a while, senior military people, senior generals, but right across the rank spectrum for both the Armed Forces Christian Union and indeed other Christian organizations like Military Missions International. So key commanders in positions where the good Lord has used them, and because they've turned to him in those situations. And then there's this broader issue, which is the nation. And I would just endorse, what's been said already. And I have to say, I can't see a situation where, and I've got to be careful about names and so forth, but the current prime minister or the current politicians would be prepared, would have the nerve, would have the the common sense to call a day of prayer. What is encouraging, of course, is Her Majesty, who every Christmas gives a wonderful Christian talk, and always, increasingly so over the last few years, has referred to Jesus Christ and the light of Christ and her own personal faith and so on, which I think is extremely encouraging for many, many people. And interestingly, when I talk to soldiers, it's not true that there are no atheists in the foxhole. There are atheists in the foxhole, but when I talk to young soldiers, they ask some very sensible questions, like what's going on here and why do people do this to each other? And that allows them to explore the whole idea of sin and evil, words that are not interesting theological debates for me and for soldiers. They're a reality of a fallen world. And that ability to speak into that means that many soldiers on operations are not far from the kingdom. They are genuinely searching and asking themselves some pretty serious questions. And so, in the round, I think it's a great, I've said in the introduction, it's a great book. I think it's a great military history book, but it just infuses, as I think somebody said earlier, infuses within it a constant thread, a golden thread of individual prayer, national prayer, key players in the stories who are able to make a difference because of their own personal faith. And, my prayer obviously would be that anybody who reads this will ask themselves some pretty serious questions.
We've got a few questions in the comments section. One of the questions is, over the period covered by the book, is there evidence of less prayer over time and fewer providential actions?
John, do you want to take that one?
say less prayer than when. I'm just trying to. So I mean, there are areas where in the First World War where things went pretty badly for some time, and so we can look at the whole, the whole series of really dreadful battles where we were near to disaster but not quite, and there was turnaround in 1918. That happened to be it was National Day of Prayer for I think it was for the one of the Dominions, maybe Canada, and there was a National Day of Prayer, and that happened I think on the 4th of August 1918, and after that things turned around. Now I don't know, maybe there were periods of time during the course of the bad years of the First World War where there was less prayer. I can't say. I mean, I don't record any because I'm dealing with turning points, which were for me 1914, 1918, and then of course the capture of Jerusalem in 1917. So yes, I mean, I think something for further research, perhaps.
Good, thank you. And another question here, again, anyone can take this question. Did any Christians speak up in favor of doing more to prevent the Holocaust? Did Christians raise their voice about that at the time? Do we know?
I'm not sure they knew about it, really, did they? I mean, I've read Martin Gilbert's book, Auschwitz and the Allies, and there's a real question about how much they knew when and all of that kind of thing in the mix of that. I mean, they did know there was anti-Semitism and all this kind of stuff. But how much Christians here or in the military actually knew what was happening, right. I think is debatable, really, in this context.
Okay. So if we sort of draw some threads together, John, what do you think we should take away from reading this book today?
Well, I think that depends upon whether you have a faith or you're, as it were, a not yet Christian or searching or asking questions. I think for Christians, it should be a huge encouragement. I mean, that we do have a creator God that does intervene in answer to prayer. And I think Christians can draw those conclusions. For the non-Christian, I think they should be interested in the history because I think it's fascinating, just a matter of record. And I hope for them that they also think to themselves, well, could there have been, was it all chance? Was there a whole series of fortunate coincidences which enabled these extraordinary events to take place? Or could there be a God who does care about his world, who responds to faith? So I hope that it will be something which will enable people to ask questions and be a prompt to explore the Christian faith.
So I was going to ask you who will read this book, and you've answered it really in that comment. Any more comments from Tim and Tim?
I can see that Archbishop Cranmer is watching and has posted a comment there. Thank you, Archbishop Cranmer. Given the book's affirmation of faith and the author's understanding of God's supernatural provision, is it worth sending a complimentary copy to every Church of England bishop, or would that be a waste of money? Well, thank you for your endorsement of the book and a great, very generous review that you provided of the book on your blog, Cranmer. We should certainly send one to all the archbishops, including you, I think, across the country. And I know it's General Synod next week, and a couple of my colleagues are on General Synod, so I'll encourage them to take some books as well, and we should think about sending it to bishops. But I think the question behind the question is, have we forgotten God's supernatural provision as a nation? And has the church forgotten God's supernatural provision? And I think it has. And I think that's kind of the problem that we're seeking to address with the book and say, hey, let's remember, here we are on Remembrance Day, let's remember God's supernatural provision in many, many ways through these times of absolutely major crisis. We've been through some kind of minor crises, with COVID and so on in this country recently, but really major crises that actually threaten to completely destroy the nation. And God supernaturally and remarkably and providentially intervened. And let's remember that on Remembrance Day. And let's remember we have a God who answers prayer, and let's try and revive those memories and encourage people back to prayer. And that's really, I think, what we're trying to do here with this book.
Thank you, Tim. And thank you, John and Tim Cross and Tim for being with us tonight. I'm just going to finish up now by saying if you're interested in history or you know someone who likes history, then the book will make a great Christmas present. And I certainly have it in mind for my father-in-law who would love to read this book. It's ranked in Military History World War I on Amazon, and it's number 6 in the bestsellers. And it's ranked 72 in World History World War II. So you can read a concise summary and access the link to purchase the book by visiting the Wilberforce Publications webpage, and hopefully a link will come up on the screen or in the comments section there. But if you go to wilberforcepublications.co.uk/beyond the odds, or follow the link on the screen, which will hopefully come up soon. The book is also available from bookstores online at £15 RRP. Well, thank you for joining us, everyone, this evening. And we really pray that you'll be stirred and impacted by reading this new publication. Well, thank you, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bless you.